I know a lot of y'all already. I'm also, David did mention, but I am the Madison County historian. I took the place of Harbert Alexander Sr. when he died a couple of years ago. I will admit now, I'm from up north. I grew up at Hicksville, and I live at Oakfield. But I was the captain at the fire station number 4 out here for 7 years. So I got to know Bemis a little bit when I was living out here for several years. About a year and a half ago, the Genealogy Society did a work day over at the Hollywood Cemetery where we cleaned a lot of tombstones. And as a result of that, you're right, I got volunteered to be on the board of directors and have been since. And I am now even employed over there part-time. I told them last week that I am a landscape maintenance engineer. I run a weed eater over there 3 days a week. And we have done an awful lot of work over there. If you have not been to Hollywood Cemetery ever or recently, I would strongly encourage you to ride through there one day. We're there working every day. There's several, at least 3 or 4 people there working every day. Molly Heimers, our office manager, is in and out of the office. So there's some of us there every day. And the question has been raised to me before, is it safe to go over there? Absolutely during the day. No, I wouldn't go over there after dark, but I'm not going to any cemetery after dark. If you don't have a direct connection to Hollywood Cemetery, as historians and genealogists, all of us have an interest in some cemetery someplace. And so I'm hoping that some of the things that I say tonight are general enough about cemeteries that they will interest you regardless of what cemetery is that you are looking at. I think as genealogists especially, we get kind of tunnel vision that a cemetery is there for me to go copy dates down for my family tree, and the rest of the time it just sits there and waits on me to come copy down more dates. And I have learned a whole lot of other sides to being involved with the cemetery by being over there. And I think it helps us to see things from other people's viewpoint when we do things like that. When Jackson was first founded in 1821, the first public burying ground, and by the way, I know that some people distinguish between the words graveyard and cemetery. I hadn't quite learned to do that yet. A graveyard's connected to a church, a cemetery stands separately, so don't get concerned if I interchange the two terms. The first public cemetery was off of what's now Johnson Street, just off of what is now Airways. It was kind of in behind the old Jackson Sun newspaper office, if you know where that is or was. But they found out pretty soon that that was also right on a creek bank, and every time it rained big, it washed away. So in 1830, they moved it to Riverside Cemetery that is still there. It's still the only Jackson City-owned cemetery, and it's still an active cemetery. Now, there was at some point another cemetery for blacks called East Side. I don't know where it was. However, Riverside has always held burials for both blacks and whites. It is one of the earliest cemeteries in the county, and it has never been a segregated cemetery. Now, in February of 1885, Mayor Robinson of Jackson made his annual report to the city leaders, and he reminded them that Riverside Cemetery was just about full. There weren't any more spaces available. And he told them they needed to get on the ball and find a place to start a new cemetery. And at the same time, the Whig newspaper ran an editorial saying that Riverside wasn't big enough for a town the size of Jackson. As early as the 1830s, a movement had started in the United States to move burial grounds out away from the crowded cities and out more into the outskirts, the suburbs. Until that time, there were primarily 3 places where you could be buried. Of course, there were the family cemeteries on the family farm. There were church cemeteries, which sometimes doubled as community cemeteries. And then in the bigger cities, there were city cemeteries. You can see this one in Boston, which is right in the middle of downtown Boston. They were cramped, a lot of space restriction. You generally got the next space available, regardless of where your family was buried. Because of the way they were placed so closely together, sometimes heavy rains, sometimes digging new graves, kind of gave you some unwanted issues, if you can get my drift. They started digging people up accidentally. They also didn't have the best reputation. They were hangouts for ne'er-do-wells, and crime was a problem in a lot of them. About the most famous two of those, this is the Granary burying ground in Boston. You'll find John Hancock's grave there, Paul Revere's, Sam Adams. This is the Christ Church burying ground in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin is buried there, along with 3 other signers of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jackson didn't fit exactly into any of those categories. It was probably somewhere across of the community cemetery and the city cemetery, I would guess. This idea for garden cemeteries, as these were called, as when they were out in the suburbs, had come from France, where as early as 1799, Emperor Napoleon found he had the same overcrowding problem with city cemeteries. They couldn't afford to waste any more space on people that weren't paying rent in the cities, and so he held a write-in contest to find a better solution. And the winner suggested that they have this garden design out in the suburbs, where he said they can be walking paths and you can have sculptures and people can go and actually enjoy basically a day in the country. And that is the Père Lachaise Cemetery. It is still the most visited cemetery in the world. Burials there range from Frédéric Chopin to Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors. Now, folks, that goes both ends of the spectrum when you go from Chopin to The Doors. And a lot of other very well-known names are buried there as well. The first of the garden cemeteries in the United States is Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's still in use today. It is a National Historic Landmark. It covers 172 acres. On Find a Grave, if you're familiar with that website and how it works, there are over 105,000 burials listed for Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's the only cemetery I know of that's got its own gift shop. And you can still be buried there. Burial spaces begin at $25,000 apiece. Now, that, of course, doesn't include all of the fees that go along with that. That's just for the price of the burial space, $25,000. And as I said, Mount Auburn is still a very heavily, it's a tourist attraction. Now, up until this time, death was seen as something frightening. And a lot of times you see in these very oldest tombstones, especially when you get up into New England and places that are a little older than us, you see that they were trying to scare people. And maybe it was, you better straighten up and fly right while there's still time, and this would scare you into that. Well, one thing that was beginning to change by the early 19th century when Jackson started looking at their problem was attitudes about death. Death was now, we were getting more into towards the Victorian era. And death wasn't seen just as a fact of life, but it was seen as a dream of going to heaven. And it was almost romantic to think about the time when I can go to heaven. I bet most of us grew up learning a little prayer about, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. It wasn't scary to think about dying. And when you think about it, most every family was losing small children, a lot of times one or both parents while they still had small children at home. And that's probably part of the reason for this change in outlook too, was that if you're trying to explain to your 6-year-old why their mother has died, you want to traumatize them just as little as necessary, right? So you don't want it to be a frightening thing. And so with this, the idea of a cemetery being a place where you could go and actually enjoy being there, spend the afternoon, with your friends, you have to look at this picture just a minute to realize that all of these Victorian people enjoying a Sunday afternoon stroll are in a cemetery. You could go there, you could visit your loved ones, you could feel some emotional release and the tranquility of nature. You could get out away from the dusty or muddy streets in town, depending upon the season, where a lot of times you still had livestock running loose and everybody still had an outhouse. And in return, or instead, you could go out here, they held carriage races, a lot of them, you could hunt and shoot. I have heard numerous people tell me that they learned to either ride a bike or drive a car in Hollywood Cemetery. So that became the impetus behind these garden cemeteries. And I will tell you now that scattered in some places throughout this program, I do have a few old pictures of families visiting Hollywood, because that's what your family did, was they went out and posed for pictures in the cemeteries. And there's one tomb in particular that everybody had to pose around in Hollywood that you will see. And so with that, you didn't have to be buried in these individual cramped spaces anymore. You could buy a family plot and all of your family be buried together. Now think about it. All of my family is buried together. We'll all be together in paradise. And when you did that, you didn't have to have just a little individual tombstone. You could now have a big family monument that was more befitting your family's rank in society. And so you started putting up family monuments such as these. And sometimes I think it probably almost became a competition to see who could outdo each other with their family monuments. And so stonework and monument work became very popular. And again, it was befitting where your family ranked or where you thought your family should rank within society. And these garden cemeteries almost became their own downfall, because they became so popular that eventually city leaders started to say, you know, this is wonderful, a place where people can go, they can stroll, they can ride horses. What if we had them, but without all the dead people? And so they started creating city cemeteries. And out of that came places like Central Park in New York. And so the city cemetery movement came from that. Well, back to Jackson and their need for a newer cemetery. This garden cemetery movement had already come to the Mid-South. Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis had come along in 1852. Just a few years after that, Mount Olivet in Nashville. So it's very likely that the people in Jackson were already familiar with this concept. And about the same time, a new cemetery for blacks was started in Jackson. It's Mount Olivet Cemetery. It's over on East Forest Street. It's still a very active cemetery. In fact, we had a memorial service there last Saturday for a World War I veteran. Then in December of 1886, a group of Jackson businessmen purchased 50 acres on the Poplar Corner Road. That's now Hollywood Drive. And they bought it from Robert Hurt, who lived in that area. These businessmen were some of the best-known businessmen in town. John L. Wisdom and Robert Fletcher ran the banks. J.W.N. Burkett was largely responsible for the starting of the West Tennessee State Fair. Stokely Hayes and Chester Bond were prominent attorneys. You get the picture. These weren't just 8 guys that got together. They were 8 of the men who ran this town. The deed was signed in February 1887, and I'm sure it was just strictly coincidence that only 3 days after that, the newspaper ran supposedly a letter from someone who had visited Paris and was writing to say how wonderful these garden cemeteries were. And oh, I visited, and the people just come by the thousands to lay flowers on the graves, and it's so beautiful. These garden cemeteries are wonderful. You remember 2 of these men ran newspapers in Jackson, by the way. Now, this new cemetery was right beside the fairgrounds. So it was a place in the suburbs that people were used to going to. This map is from the 1880s, and if you look down in the lower left corner, that is where the fairgrounds was. Just above that is the big open square. That's Hollywood Cemetery. Just to the right of that, you see 4 lots that are divided off for houses. Those houses today would be in the front yard of the University of Memphis Lambeth campus, because that street that they're on was Long Street at the time. It's Lambeth Boulevard now. So that white square up in the top left corner is today Hollywood Cemetery. The streetcars, when the streetcars came along, turned around right in the front gate of Hollywood Cemetery. So it was convenient too. You could go out, spend a day picnicking in the country with your family, visit your family graves, and then be back home before dark. The owners hired Benjamin Grove from Louisville. He was a landscape architect, and he was going to lay out the cemetery for them. Now, he was probably the second most famous landscape architect in the country. About the only one bigger than him was Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park and the Biltmore Estate. Grove was to lay out carriage roads. He was to lay out the different family plots around the cemetery, borders, walkways, the places where trees and shrubs were to be planted. He was to mark off a place for single graves for use by the city, which is still that thing today. It's still a section of single graves. And he would supervise this work, although the owners were actually doing the work. He was going to lay out sections A through I. Now, to give you let you get your bearings if you're not extremely familiar, down in the bottom left corner is the entrance gate to the cemetery. Along the far right-hand side would be the back of the University of Memphis campus. In the top left corner where you see the arrow pointing north, that's Hollywood Shopping Center. So the original sections are the ones that are lettered A through I. It's about the front half of the cemetery. And we realized yesterday in looking at, we said, these are the very oldest graves in section I. And then it occurred to us, they would have been right on the back fence at that time. So these are the people that wanted privacy and picked the very back row of the cemetery. Now it's about in the middle of the cemetery. Grove was also to make an individual map of the owners of all of these sections. And those original maps still exist. They're up in the Tennessee room at the library. Now, where these sometimes come in handy is if you're looking for somebody in these older sections who may be in an unmarked grave, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. One example that I can remember in particular, there was a man who was the caretaker of the cemetery named Pitzer Doyle. He's supposed to be buried in the cemetery, but he doesn't have a marked grave. But I did find where there are 2 women with the same last name who died to where they would have been contemporaries of his. So I went to this map, looked up to see who owned the plot where they are buried, and the plot owner was Pitzer Doyle. Now, maybe he's not buried on the plot that he owned, but I would certainly think he is. And so sometimes it may help us find where people are just by seeing who's buried on that plot. Another thing I have found is where there may be 1 or 2 generations on the family plot, and yet when people look back at the original owner, it may have been great-granddaddy a generation further back than what they realized. So it may be that they have more family buried on that family plot than what they thought. Well, by 1887, the owners announced they were ready to start selling plots. The first plot, the first burial in the cemetery, was a Captain Thomas Lewis. He died in the fall of 1887. His grave is on the left, just as you go in the gate, over close to where the Clarence Pigford family is buried. In those 1891 cemetery board minutes, there is a list of people that had bought plots over the last 3 or 4 years. And so we know that those were some of the earliest plot owners. It tells exactly where their plots were. And the interesting thing, and it took Jack Wood and I a while to figure this out up at the Tennessee room, is that a lot of them not only had bought plots, but they had also paid for grave openings. So whether there is a marked grave on that plot now or not, we know that there had been burials of some type there. And then when we looked, we saw that some grave openings cost $3 and some cost $1.50. And when we compared those to the graves on the plots, we realized $3 was an adult and $1.50 was a child. And there's about as many of one as there are the other. There is one other grave dated that first year, 1887, but we know that that stone is not that old, because if you can read it up here, it has two names on it. One of them did die in 1887, but the other one didn't die until 1914. So we know that the stone is not as old as the date of death. There are actually 22 graves in the cemetery that have dates of death older than what the cemetery is. I don't think any of those people are actually buried there. I think that they're just memorialized. I doubt seriously if they attempted to move the bodies. This is one of those. This is one of Joe Exum's ancestors. And I know because he told me that this stone was moved from another cemetery to Hollywood. So even though it says 1858, that man is not buried in Hollywood Cemetery. There are also, this is from the next year, there's only 5 graves from 1888. 3 of them are 3 siblings. One of the oldest of them, I believe, was 5, one was 3, and one was 1. They all died within a week of each other. And this isn't in the script, but I've got to tell you, yesterday 2 families came to visit, and this was their family. And the father in the family, when he looked to see who the parents of these 3 children were, he said, that would have been my granddaddy's brothers and sister, and I never knew they existed. So, made us feel good that we had fixed these stones and gotten them all aligned and set back up. There are a few listings on Find a Grave. How many of you use Find a Grave? If you're not familiar with it, once a cemetery site or page is in there, anybody can enter names into that cemetery. Now, you are strongly encouraged to enter pictures of the grave. There are at least 13 listings on Find a Grave that are earlier than the date of the cemetery, and I can't find any indication whatsoever that any of those people are buried at Hollywood. I think they have been listed probably by mistake. So as genealogists, we probably all know rule number 1 is whenever you can, go to the source. Don't take everything you see on there as gospel. It may be right, but sometimes it may not. Then in 1896, the owners sold 2 acres on Poplar Corner Road to the Temple B'nai Israel for the Jewish cemetery. It's still there. It still adjoins Hollywood Cemetery. It's still an active cemetery for the Temple B'nai Israel congregation. Some people don't realize these are 2 totally separate cemeteries. They're divided by a knee-high wrought iron fence that goes back to way before World War II, but they are not the same cemetery with a Jewish section. It is a separately owned cemetery. The cemetery hasn't always been as peaceful and quiet a spot as it would appear to you most days when you're out there. In 1926, 2 tombstone carvers in Jackson were feuding. One of them was named J.C. Bevel. He ran the monument works right across from the front gate of Hollywood Cemetery. There's still a monument works there today. Has been ever since then. The other one's name was Will Lane. Do any of you remember the Lane mansion that used to sit right in the middle of Grand Street, the big 2-story Civil War house? That was Will Lane's house. It blew away in a tornado back in the 1970s. That was Will Lane's house. Well, Will Lane got a phone call from somebody saying, I need you to meet me at Hollywood Cemetery to talk about a tombstone. Well, his first clue that something wasn't exactly copacetic should have been when he said, well, who is this? And the guy said, you'll find out when you get here. Well, Will Lane went, and he was standing talking to one of the caretakers in the cemetery when J.C. Bevel pulled up and pulled out a buggy whip and started hitting Will Lane with it. Lane decked him, knocked him down, and as he fell, a pistol fell out of J.C. Bevel's pocket. So Will Lane took off running, Bevel chasing him, shooting at him as they ran. They ran out the front gate, through the front and out the back of a nearby grocery store, shooting as they went. Bevel was charged with assault with intent to commit murder. And I think it's worth noting that neither one of those stonecutters are buried at Hollywood Cemetery. Both of the caretakers who were there that day and saw it happen and testified about it in court are buried at Hollywood Cemetery, though. And then the next significant record as far as the property was in 1961 when Lambeth College asked to buy 15 acres that had so far been unused for burials. Now, Lambeth backed right up to the back fence of the property, and the stockholders may have by this time seen that they weren't likely to ever need those 15 acres. Ridgecrest and Highland Memorial Gardens were both in business by this time. And so they told Lambeth, we'll sell it to you, but only if we sell you the entire cemetery. So Lambeth bought Hollywood Cemetery, all 48 acres. They'd taken 2 off for the Jewish cemetery. They cut away the 15 acres that they wanted. Now, this is a Google map shot fairly recently, and over on the right side, you can see where Burkett Street divides now by the Lambeth campus. It used to go straight on through. And this was when they divided Burkett Street because they built a dormitory there that it would have run right through the middle of. Down in the bottom right under the word Maple Street are the tennis courts and the softball field. Right above that is the athletics building with the gym and the indoor pool. All of that land would have up until that time been part of Hollywood Cemetery, all the way up to the corner of Burkett and Arlington Street. So the football stadium would have been part of Hollywood Cemetery too. So what Lambeth did then was they took off the 15 acres that they wanted and they advertised the rest of the cemetery back up for sale. Now, apparently nobody was just really antsy to get into the cemetery business, so they didn't have any buyers. So after a time, they sold the 33 acres that remained of it to the Hollywood Cemetery Association, which was the actual plot owners rather than the stockholders of the cemetery. That's the way that the cemetery remains today. If you own a plot or have family buried at Hollywood Cemetery, you are part owner of it. There is no owner other than the people who own family plots there. They sold it back to the association for $25,000. And at the same time, the college set up an endowment fund of $100,000 to care for the cemetery. And I believe that today it is a state law in Tennessee that if you sell a cemetery, you have to set up an endowment fund to help care for it so that somebody can't just walk away and leave it and abandon it. Well, then in 1986, the Midwest Tennessee Genealogy Society and Jackson Utility Division partnered up to go through and do a volunteer reading of the entire cemetery and listed all of the burials in the cemetery. Now, again, back to this, as genealogists and historians go to the source when possible. There are a few mistakes in that book. When you do a book with volunteers that's this thick, there are going to be a few mistakes. But one of the things that I have found is that there were some graves read in 1986 that we can't find anymore today. So you think about, had that book not been done, those graves and all record of them would have been lost to us forever. But we have it now, even though the stones aren't still there. There are also a few that we found. It took some doing. This was one that was in the book, so I knew it had existed, and I saw just that little bit of white stone sticking out of the ground. And when we got to digging around and dug it up, lo and behold, it's a tombstone. It's only about this big. So it's now been dug up, cleaned, and reset. So again, those stones would have been lost had it not been for the volunteers that did that book. So now I want to talk about burials at Hollywood. There are 754 marked graves that date from the time the cemetery opened in 1887 up to 1914. And the magic number about 1914 is that's when the state started having death certificates and recording officially deaths. Up to that time, we only have two ways of knowing about burials at the cemetery. Either they have a tombstone, so we know they're there, or there are a very few scattered records still existing from Griffin Funeral Home. They give various amounts of information. This one tells us everything that you could ever want to know, not only the name of the deceased, her birth and death dates, her cause of death, where she lived, everything about her casket, what kind of dress she was in. Some of the others just say, unknown man found by railroad tracks. But the catch is that these are just a few scattered records. This is a period that covers 26 years. And there are only, those records cover a total of about 4.5 out of those 26 years. So in all of those other years, unless they have a tombstone, we don't have any way of knowing who they are, where they are, or when they were buried. But we know that there are other burials there. It appears that Griffin Funeral Home at that time was averaging about 40 burials a year. And so while we've got 112 of these records, there probably would have been about 1,000 Griffin burials during that time. Now, undoubtedly, a few of those are the tombstones that are there, but a lot of them are not. We also know that if we look at the timing of these records that we've got and compare them to dates on tombstones, there are a lot of dated tombstones of people that were buried while these records cover, but Griffin Funeral Home is not the one that buried them. So we know that there was at least one other funeral home in Jackson. There was one called Sparkman, and there may have been others. No records of them exist, and we don't know how many burials they were doing. So there's really no accurate way to guess how many unknown burials there are during those first 26 years. And then in 1914, the state started requiring death certificates to be filed. But for the first few years, it was a little bit hit and miss. The doctors were trying to get used to something new. And one of the things they were supposed to be doing was writing down in this bottom right-hand corner where the deceased was to be buried. Now, this one's from 1915, and it tells us that James A. Smith was going to be buried by Sparkman Funeral Home at Hollywood Cemetery. He is there. He's got a marked grave. This one is also from 1915, and it tells us that Lida Kirby is buried we don't know where because they didn't fill it in. Thank goodness she does have a marked grave. She's buried in Pinson, but it's not because the doctor told us this on the death certificate. So again, there are undoubtedly some burials that are from this time period that we don't know about. That also, I have gone through Madison County death records, 1 year at a time, up until 1939, from 1914 to 39. That's when the cemetery starts having records of their own. And I have found at least 500 people during that time period of 24 years buried at Hollywood Cemetery, according to the records, who don't have tombstones. So here's 500 more. We know they're there. We don't know where. That doesn't even include people who died in another county or another state and were brought back in here to be buried. And about 25% of the burials during that time were being brought in from other counties and other states. And I'm not about to sit down and check every county in the state of Tennessee. I will tell you, just a tip thrown in here as genealogist, if you're looking for a death record for a family member during those teens, 20s, early 30s, and they lived in Madison County and you can't find it, look in Hardeman County. I have found an awful lot of them who were dying at Western State Hospital in Bolivar during that time. And as best I can tell from looking at it, it was basically being used as a nursing home. So there's a lot of Madison County deaths that were taking place in Hardeman County, and of course that's where the death certificate then would have been filed. Now, beginning with 1939, we do have records. The originals, or the carbon copies that we have, are up in the Tennessee room of the library. They're good, they're not perfect. How many of you remember writing using carbon paper? And if you forgot to take that next sheet out, then you wound up writing on about 3 or 4 pages sometimes, and so it bleeds through onto more than one page that you want it to. That's the case here. And sometimes some of these records, you can't really tell if it's written on this page or if it's bled through from another page. Also, some of the handwriting and some of the spelling is, let's just say, a little bit creative. But they are pretty complete as far as we know of people who had died, who were being buried. They tell us what type of, whether they're in just a wooden box or a vault. They tell us what section of the cemetery they're buried in. They tell us which funeral home was handling the burial, and they tell us whether they charged them $3 or $4 for the burial. Again, I looked back at a few of the deaths to see the difference in the price. $4 was the overtime rate if you died on a holiday or a weekend. So we don't know where all of these people are buried. We know the section, but we can look and see if the family owned a family plot. You assume they're on the family plot, but you don't know that for sure. And as I said, this used to be where you went to pose for calendar shots, as my big sister did way before I came along. Now, starting in from 1963 to 1986, we haven't found any records for the cemetery. I think that what happened was that there was a great big old rambling house just inside the gates that was used as the office, and several years ago it burned down, and I think that all of those records burned up when that house burned. So from 63 to 86, we don't have any cemetery records. And then beginning with 1986, we do have records. Even though for a few of those years, they consist of a wall calendar, and written in on any given date, it's the name of the deceased, the funeral home doing the burial, and what space they were being buried in. The only catch with these is if it's somebody that was being brought in from out of state, you're probably not going to find a obituary in the Jackson Sun. And so some of these names, I really don't even know a lot about who they were because I don't know where they were coming from. They may have died in California and be being sent home. And if there's no obit in the Jackson Sun, I don't know where to look to find out anything about them. I will tell you, we keep better records than that today. Today, the records are very well kept, but they haven't always been that way. And a lot of people wonder when they call, and this would apply to any cemetery, well, why don't you have records to show it? Well, it just hadn't always been that way. And when you get into especially these little country cemeteries, as I call them, they probably didn't have a record book, and if they did, who knows where it is now. There are veterans buried at Hollywood from the Civil War up through the Gulf War. They did put out a brochure a few years ago saying that there were Confederate veterans, but they were not aware of any Union veterans. Well, I can correct that. I can show you several. In fact, this Henry Wells on the far left side, you may be able to see 57th Pennsylvania Infantry. I guarantee you he was not a Confederate soldier in the Pennsylvania Infantry. There are several Union veterans buried there. There are at least 63 veterans buried there who died as a direct result of either World War I, World War II, or Korea. For Memorial Day, we were going to try to place flags on the government veteran markers like these that you see here. There were over 600 of them. We ran out of flags. I don't know how many more veterans there are buried there who don't have a veteran's marker, who just have, their personal marker. My guess would be at least another 600. But that's a shot in the dark. I don't have any idea. On the other hand, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies. There's one section that's almost nothing but babies. And a lot of them, as you saw on one of these, just say baby. We may not know whose baby they were. We don't know when they died. We just know it's a baby burial. So how many people are buried at Hollywood? That's a really good question, and we'll never know the answer to it. Last year, I went through and photographed every tombstone in the cemetery, a section at a time. When I went to the Find a Grave website, if there was not a listing for that burial, I added one. If there was a listing but no photograph for the grave, I added one. So the Hollywood Find a Grave site is as accurate as I'm going to brag and say as any Find a Grave site on the internet today. There are 11,070 something, I think now, you can update from this a little bit, known marked burials. There are at least another 1,120 that we know from records of some type are buried there, whether it's a death certificate, an obituary, from the sexton records that I showed you, but they don't have a marked grave, so we don't know in most cases exactly where. Now, I tried coming up with several different formulas to try to guesstimate how many other burials there are that we'll never know anything about. I think 1,500 is an extremely conservative number. My guess would be it may be 2,000. Now, to give you some, so the total burials, we know over 12,000, possibly 14,000. To let you compare that to some of the other cemeteries in the area, and again, these are just from the Find a Grave site, so I don't know if they're complete or not. You can see here, Ridgecrest 5,400, Highland Memorial Garden 8,900. The Garden Cemeteries down at the bottom, Elmwood in Memphis has 43,000. Arlington National Cemetery has 430,000. What's the biggest cemetery in the south part of the county? Maple Springs at Mercer? Maybe. Comparison for cemeteries in this area, Bemis Cemetery on the Find a Grave site shows about 700 burials. Ebenezer shows about 1,000. Maple Springs at Mercer shows about 1,900. By comparison, Hollywood has over 12,000. There are not that many so-called famous people buried at Hollywood, and that's obviously a relative term. The founders of Jackson are buried at Riverside Cemetery. I would say that Hollywood are the men and women who built this town. They might not have started it, but they built it. And so if you drive through there, you'll see names that you recognize like Tigert, Spraggins, Murray, Holland, Wisdom, Crook, Birmingham, and of course Jackson's most famous businesswoman, Ollie Pope. And some of you gave yourselves away by laughing. You know who Ollie Pope was. She's the woman who made Jackson. So where is Hollywood today? First off, some people are surprised to find that it's not full. We do still have plots for sale. It has burials today. Today, Hollywood averages about 30 burials a year. By comparison, Highland Memorial Gardens told me that they run about 150 a year. Ridgecrest said they have about 100 a year. And even now, for one reason or another, some graves go unmarked. Used to, the funeral homes always put these temporary markers up with a grave. Now that's an option that you pay extra for. So some people don't even get that put up. And when those are left without a permanent marker over time, kind of like this one, they eventually disappear. And this is not just a long ago thing, it's still. Over the past 15 years, there have been 27 people buried at Hollywood who don't have a tombstone. Now, a few of those are ones that are very recent burials that just haven't gotten the tombstone put down yet. But some of them are ones that probably at this point never will have a tombstone put down. A lot of people think that Hollywood is either owned by or supplemented by the city and county. I wish. It is not. It's owned by you, the people who own plots there. The city and county does not contribute one penny towards Hollywood Cemetery. By comparison, Ridgecrest and Highland Memorial Gardens belong to the second largest for-profit cemetery company in the United States who is not Tennessee-based. Hollywood, though, is owned by the families who have loved ones buried there. And while a lot of smaller neighborhood cemeteries expect a yearly fee from their families, It's a little bit harder for us to do that at Hollywood because so many of the burials are so long ago that we no longer know who the families even are. We do have a lot of families who do support us, but I will tell you, outgo never matches the income. The difference, as I said then, is that Riverside belongs to the city of Jackson. The other two big ones in town belong to a for-profit company. Hollywood belongs to the owners. Now, one difference that's always visible in any cemetery to anybody is maintenance. Our caretaker at Hollywood, Roger Robinson, has been there for 30 years. Before that, he was with one of the funeral homes here in town for a number of years. If you visited Hollywood Cemetery, he recognizes you, believe me. He knows what grave you visit. He knows what kind of flowers you bring. Most people that come and ask about a grave, he can take them right to it without even having to look in the book. Over the last few years, Hollywood has a few times, and sometimes even rightfully so, gotten a lot of criticism about upkeep. It did get bad at one time. It takes about 200 man hours to mow and trim that cemetery one time. That comes out to 4 men working 5 days a week for 2 weeks, 5 hours a day. And when you finish, you go right back and start over again. Now that's hoping that it doesn't rain, that nothing breaks down, that all your equipment doesn't get stolen, as it already has twice this year, that you don't have to stop for somebody to have a funeral service. And the reason I said 5 hours instead of 8 is because I've also learned that when it's 98 degrees and a man tries to run a weed eater for 8 hours, for long he's not an employee, he's a resident of the cemetery because he's going to kill himself. Over the past couple of months, we have reset on their base or straightened or repaired several hundred markers that actually belong to the families, not to the cemetery, because we want to show respect for these people and we want the place to look good. And so a lot of work has been done. Almost all of that is privately funded. The cemetery just cannot afford to do it. Plus, as I said, these markers belong to the families, not the cemetery. During the course of that, we have actually found some that we didn't know about. This was a veteran's grave from World War I that had sunk almost totally into the ground so that the only thing showing was his first name. And Roger and I managed to get it, straps around it, pull it up out of the ground, and by putting a base under it, reset it so that it's now readable. This one was about 6 or 8 inches deep, laying horizontal on the ground. I hit it by accident with the shovel when I was actually looking for something else. It had been underground for at least 40 years. We don't know how long before that. It's now been repaired and reset on its base. This one you really can't tell how big it is, and we didn't know how big it was when we found it. It's about 1 foot deep in the ground, or it was. When we started digging around it, we couldn't find the bottom of it. And so eventually we got the excavator and dug it up. That's about a 400-pound tombstone. It's about 18 inches thick. And after a time, we poured a base for it. We reset it. She is now, her stone is sitting above ground right next to her husband like it was at one time before it collapsed into the ground. This is the most recent one we found. It was above ground, but it was laying face down and had been laying there so long that nobody realized it was a tombstone. And then we lifted it up a little bit one day and realized it had lettering on the bottom of it. And so it's been reset on its base. It's been cleaned, and now, this was done right after we put it up. Now it's more like about the color of those stones you see that we set it on for a base. It has cleaned up really well. Of course, the Genealogy Society also, some of you may know Mike Alexander from Henderson, who does professional stone repair work. We had hired Mike Alexander. He repaired over a dozen of the older major broken stones and worked for a couple of years doing that and has now finished that work. In 2022, we had a big storm come through, blew down 11 enormous oak trees, did a great amount of damage, knocked over a lot of tombstones. This is Kathy. I've got on my glasses. Kathy isn't here tonight, I don't think. This is Kathy Haney Williams' father's grave and the way it looked the day after that storm. There you see what the size of those trees were. It cost $39,000 just to get those trees cleaned up. And a lot of stones got knocked over by it. Some of them we have gotten reset. Some of them are still on the ground. Largely because they're so big, we don't have the equipment to set them up with. And we're going to have to hire a tombstone company to come in and reset them. We can't pick them up. Some of these stones weigh 1,500 pounds. We have people in and out of Hollywood all day. Yesterday, there were probably about a dozen families that came through during the day. We've got people that come and walk at lunchtime. We've got a young man with a 1-year-old golden retriever that comes to let him run and play in the mornings. And believe me, that dog loves playing in the cemetery and running loose. We've got 2 professional photographers that come just to take pictures. There was a lady there last month who's from Nashville and has a website, and she had driven down from Nashville because she had heard people talking about how beautiful Hollywood Cemetery in Jackson was, and she wanted to come down and see it and take pictures. So, garden cemeteries today are doing different things to try to keep themselves relevant and afloat. Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis has concerts and shows movies. They have food trucks. You can buy a picnic lunch and have supper on the grounds and watch a movie. They give walking tours for a fee. The Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., you can buy a membership to walk your dog in the cemetery. It's $400 a year per dog. And they say on their website that is their major means of income now, is the dog walking club. Hollywood, to this point, has only resorted to shameless begging. And believe me, we do a lot of that. But we are working on a couple of things to help at least supplement the income, and hopefully we will continue to have donors who will contribute. I hope that something about this in your own home cemetery, your community cemetery, it's given you some insight into just what all is involved. And when you go out there once or twice a year and the grass is a little taller than you think it should be, it may not be that nobody cares. It just takes everybody. Us as historians, as genealogists, it's up to everybody to take care of these places and to make sure that they don't get forgotten or abused or overlooked. And I hope that you will continue to do that in all of the cemeteries in this area for the future generations. Thank you very much.